Yeah. So what are we gonna do today? Um, there are a lot of videos that where we put a lot of different concepts um, into one video, and basically people have gotten back to me with the feedback that, hey, just like make it smaller, make it easier, because it's all new to me. So what we're going to do today is something very different. We're going to create a server-side rendered page, no JavaScript whatsoever, right? It's a really classical CRUD application, and going to keep it as simple as possible, just to kind of like see, so we can concentrate more on the single steps, right? So this video is basically just installation with, like, okay, what could happen and so on. So prerequisites, before we jump in, are you should have installed MySQL, or MariaDB, something that's close enough. Then PHP, of course. So you need at least version 7.4. I'm going to use 8, but I'm not going to use any features that you can't do in 7.4. But I'm going to use typing, right? So 7.4 is basically the minimum you want to go for. And what you need then is Composer and ideally Git, right? So I'm going to use a Windows machine for this video. So the easiest way to achieve this setup is to load something like XAMPP, right, from Apache Friends, XAMPP. That will kind of like, you just click on one of the versions. Again, I would recommend PHP 8, and that ships with everything that you will need and kind of like work out of the box. You've seen in other videos that you can do this with Vagrant and virtual machines, and you can of course do this directly on or on different OS systems and so on. So I mean, whatever is necessary on your machine to make that work, right? Those are the prerequisites. So you need PHP, MySQL, Composer. That's what you want. And so if you've met those prerequisites, then the first thing you want to do is to basically install the neoan3 CLI globally. If you have a older version of, or basically just start with that either way, right? So what you kind of want to do, let me open up a terminal here. What you kind of want to do first is simply Composer global, then neoan3 / neoan3, right? Oh, don't forget to require. Okay, actually, I know that I'm up to date, but I'm gonna let that run nonetheless. Nothing to modify. Yep, that's basically it. So just to make sure that you have that. Then the next thing that you want to make sure is that that's in your path, right? So if I run neoan3 v, then this should be there, right? So currently we're using version 1.5.1. Okay, so once you have that, right? And so if you're, by the way, if you're running something like XAMPP, make sure it's running. So both the Apache and MySQL should run. Why Apache? Well, so we can kind of like play around with a couple of things in an easy way. But for now, let's just basically run this. So one other thing you want to make sure of is that you can run PHP directly from the CLI. If there's any kind of pathing issues, like resolve those first. Okay, so far so good. But then Composer wouldn't have worked. Let's now more or less just start with a new app, right? So we're going to say neoan3 new app. Now I already created a folder, as you can see. I'm going to run this directly in here. I'm going to call it neoan3 glass, because we're going to try out a new CSS setup later in the day. But for this video, this is all we want. So we're going to run the installation. Okay, skip dev dependencies. That's fine for now. So the very next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to run neoan3 develop. Okay, so that runs the dev server. let's quickly have an overview of what we got here. So as you can see, this installed our framework here. So we should be all good and up running. Let me actually switch the to what we see here. Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is already the output, right? As you can see, this is exactly the server that we ran. And now we have this little introduction page where we could jump in if we wanted to right now and kind of like explore what's going on, what are the changes and so on. But we don't really want to dabble into this right now. What we kind of want to do today is to set up a new frame, right? So let me kind of like quickly explain what's going on here. So if you look at this, then you see that, so the underscore neon, you never need to touch this. This is the framework itself. The assets, as you can imagine, like right now it only has a favicon, but whatever needs to be in here. Component is basically our bread and butter, right? So this is where we're going to create functionality in a component-based approach. A frame is kind of like the project setup, if you want so. So as you can see, there's a demo frame, and it's also the one currently running. Let's quickly see what this is doing. So this extends serve, right, which is a neoan3 class. It reads a couple of settings here, and most importantly, so do you see how we assign providers here in the frame? So what are we going to use? Those can be dependency injected, as you can see. This is interesting if you chain frames or test frames and so on. For now, we're pretty happy with the idea to say like, okay, so we need one auth provider and we need one database provider. And that's fine in theory. But again, we're going to start kind of like from scratch and see how that kind of looks like. So let's close this. Let's jump into a terminal. Let's maybe open up a new one, let the development run. And simply say, okay, neoan3, new frame, and let's call it glass. Okay, no feedback here, but if I close this, you will see that I have another folder now in frame called glass. So let's see how a folder comes into here. Okay, so this makes a couple of assumptions here. As you can see, a little bit of boilerplate. It kept the DB provider, and here we're overriding the constants. This is, we're going to see, so per default, this is loading Tailwind, right, as a simple integration, no bundle. And that's the first thing that we kind of want to change. So how do we see changes? Well, so our demo component, right, is probably the first thing that we kind of like want to change. So let's do the following. Let's create a, let's first go to component, go to the demo component, go to the demo controller. And so do you see in this line where it says reloading the frame demo? So instead of that, what we want to do is let's load glass and see what happens. So this should throw a database error now. Right? So if I throw this, yep. Okay. So I expected this error to happen. Why? Well, because we don't have this database, right, that is defined here. So the very first thing that we want to do is to create that and say, all right, neoan3, new database. And now let's call it glass, maybe. So let's stick to the naming convention. Okay, so I have no credentials as of now, as you can see. So I'm going to press X. And I want to call those credentials glass DB. And this is already going to go over a CLI template. It's a standard one for databases. So again, with the SAM setup, like localhost is correct. Name of the database shall be glass. That's also correct. The user defaults to root. That's also correct. And the password, in my case, I'm going to leave empty. Port, that's a standard port. I'm happy with that. And assumes UID. This is something to do with how the provider handles it. And in my case, I want to say yes. Okay, so far, so good. Now, does that mean the database is created? Yes, it does. And at the same time, I want to make this very small change here and say, okay, glass DB. And if I now load it, this is all fine. I mean, of course, you can see we have no styling, so it's not very beautiful. But we basically have our database set up. I can verify this in my PHP Storm and kind of like create a new data source here. In my case, that would be MariaDB. And my user is root, password is empty, and glass is my database. Let's test this quickly. Yep. Okay. And here you can basically see, I mean, it's an empty database, but it exists. Okay. So far, so good. Now, in theory, you could face a couple of issues depending on your permission sets and so on. If you find yourself that the command that we just ran says like could not save, I forgot what the error message is, but if it tells you, hey, we couldn't store those credentials, then there are two things that you could do. So the default credential path is the highest level of the current OS. Come on. Disk. So in my case, C, and then it looks into C credentials, credentials.json. If you have any kind of write issues with that, because this is above your user and you're not running as a administrator, that's all fine and dandy. So what you do is you simply open up an Explorer, go to C, create credentials, and as you can see, in my case, that worked like a charm. You can actually see like what we just entered here, right? And what you do is you create an empty JSON here, right in here. So see credentials, and then run it again and it will work fine. The second option you have is to run the command neoan3 set credential path, and then put in a path of wherever you want to wherever you want this to be stored, where your PHP has access to, right? This is like, I don't know, wherever that might be, right? Yeah, I don't know your path. That depends on your setup, of course, right? Those are the two options that you have. And then that kind of issue is resolved. Okay, and that's now for the very simplistic, that's already it, right? This is all you need to do in order to let this run. And I'm going to leave it as that. I mean, even though this is hard for me to just stop here, but this is just an installation video, and we're going to set up, we're going to go from here, right? So in the next video, we're going to now add Css Framework, and in the video after that, we're going to create a registration and so on. So stay tuned, and I see you soon.